It looks like it's 3 by our clock here.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon. We are going to, we'll soon be upon the fateful day of December when Pearl Harbor was struck. A brilliant Japanese maneuver. It denuded us of our battleship fleet. But we're not going to talk about that this month or this year that remains. But we are going to talk soon about VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, in 5 phases. And then the next one will be VJ Day in 3 phases. And then it will be the time of Christmas. So we're going to talk about the Roman Empire at the time of Christ's birth and life. And then we're going to talk about, it'll be time for New Year's. So we're going to guess what President Biden will have on his plate. One of the things he'll have on his plate is a very ugly issue. In the New York Times yesterday, there was a big editorial that suggested that Biden's Justice Department bring charges against President Trump. And I actually agree with that because I think his 4 years were egregiously criminal. Not everybody agrees, but certainly would be worth looking into. And whether we want to look in, or whether Biden wants to look in, or whether Harris wants to look in, there is a judge named Vance who lives in the Southern District of New York, and he's in charge of that district. And he is waiting with a lot of loaded questions about income tax. And so whether Biden does anything or not, you can make sure that there will be something coming out of the Southern District of New York. But ours is not to search for vengeance. And maybe Biden will have the feeling of a kind of Shakespeare character. There was a woman named Portia, and her famous speech in Merchant of Venice is, quote, "The quality of mercy is not strained. It falleth from the heavens like the gentle rain," end quote. So maybe that's Biden. Maybe it's not. It sure is not the man in the Southern District of New York. And since we're talking about courts, I'd like to tell you that after we discussed the court last time, the court made a disastrous, I think, decision. The decision had to do with about whether or not the government could restrict the number of people at religious services. I certainly believe they have the right to do so. So does Governor Cuomo of New York. But somehow the court, in its own unique way, with, I remind you, since I am one, with 6 Roman Catholics sitting on the Supreme Court now, they decided that the governor of New York, nor any other, could restrict the number of people at a church service. Now, in its own way, I think that's murder. Whether any of those people die, they will bring back with them death to innocent people. And I think there is no excuse for that. But of course, you might have noticed I'm not a member of the Supreme Court. But I do wonder what they are thinking of when they supposedly think about us and our ability to survive this hellacious pandemic, which is only getting worse, not better. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about happier days. As Franklin Roosevelt would have said, happy days are here again. And the war came late for America, which it always does. We were late for World War I. We were late for World War II. The Allies had been in World War II since 1939. We didn't get in until the end of 41. Nevertheless, we got in. And Roosevelt was very anxious to get in, but he was being watched carefully by a Senate that was full of people who did not want to get in, particularly very powerful senators who didn't trust Franklin, and for good reason. Franklin did things that were impeachable. He chased after Nazi submarines in the Atlantic, got on top of them. He wasn't there, but his submarine was. And his submarine would stay on top and then wave to a British cruiser, here, come over here and bomb here. There's one of them right under here. And so they were forcing German submarines to the surface or sinking them. And in any other's book of war, it's an act of war. And Roosevelt was doing it. Strange, these things people do. Now, as the war went on, we had three Allied leaders who truly mattered, since the French had surrendered early in the war and were now occupied. We had Britain, the UK, we had America, the USA, and we had Soviet Russia, the USSR. And they were certainly strange bedfellows. You talk about murder. Stalin wasn't even a Russian, but he was a mass murderer. Killed himself, close to several million, and then led the Soviet Union into a disastrous alliance with Nazi Germany, which only resulted in being struck by the Germans. And then the problems were how to save Russia so that she didn't fall out of the war. It was a really difficult time. We at home were rationing everything. I can remember my mother and father had a ration book, and they carefully watched what they spent. And we had family down in Georgia, and they used to send us food because they had a huge farm. So we would get not only watermelons, which I loved, but big hams, because they slaughtered their own and sent us what they could. But other people weren't as happy or as able to get to this. And so it was a hard time for most Americans during World War II, at home and abroad. Nevertheless, we were in it. And Roosevelt was depending on California for two big things. We were to build so many ships so rapidly that we could build a bridge of ships from the East Coast to Europe, and you could walk over. And then when we weren't building those, which were here in the Bay Area where they were mainly built, down in Long Beach, they were building airplanes like you wouldn't believe, so that you could fly tail to tail all the way to Europe. And so we were the arsenal of democracy in many, many ways. And while the British built a better airplane than we did, we built more of them. The British built the Spitfire, wonderful airplane. And so with these ships and these airplanes, the American president, once we were in the war, wanted to meet with his fellow naval officer, he called him, meaning Churchill, and they met offshore. Churchill steamed over on the newest great battleship and met off the coast of Canada with our president. You have to remember all during this time that our president is crippled. seriously crippled. And so it's very hard for him to go anywhere, but he goes secretly down to the Potomac River and gets on this Coast Guard cutter that had been turned into the presidential yacht. This Coast Guard cutter is here with us in the Bay Area still today. You can go visit it. It's wonderful. I used to take my students there. It made history come alive. And there, you'd go on board and then they'd show you this very strange thing. There was several smokestacks, but there was one particular that was dear to FDR's heart because it actually wasn't a smokestack. It swings open and it opens upon a elevator. And it's this elevator that took him down into the heart of the ship so that he could then get back in his wheelchair, go out and sit on the fantail and have his famous martini. Good for him. And he would then scoot out to meet Churchill. But the two of them, both Churchill and FDR, were anxious to meet Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin wasn't even a Russian. It's pathetic, but he wasn't. He was a Georgian, although they hate him in Georgia because he did much to kill the Georgian aristocracy, what there was of it. This man of steel, Stalin. And he was willing to come out because he had a bone to pick with these two allies. But he was very careful of where he would go. He would only go as far as Tehran. The reason for that is that he was already controlling the northern part of Iran because we were sending him a lot of Lend-Lease, and we would send it in to the Persian Gulf, then up to Tehran, and from Tehran, his people would take it the rest of the way. And we're talking about big time stuff, entire airplane factories, everything you could imagine were being shipped up to this man, but we didn't know him. Now, Churchill felt he knew him. Churchill had said, I'd go to hell if necessary to make a deal with the devil if necessary to defeat Herr Hitler. So obviously he'd go to Stalin, and he did. And we went several times via Averell Harriman. And Harriman was a tall, good-looking governor of New York, and he was married to Mary Harriman. But the male animal. So once when he came to London on his way to Moscow, he met a notorious British woman, Pamela Digby, Churchill. She was married to a Churchill, Hayward Harriman. But before she was even married to him, Harriman had a love affair with her. It's rather notorious. It was the scandal of Mayfair. It happened at a dinner party. It happened when the Mayfair guests were instructed to go to the underground because there was an air raid. So Pamela and Averell stayed upstairs and made love on the dining room table. These are hard up times. And later she married him after her famous affair with Mr. Churchill, not Churchill Sr., Churchill Jr., and the guy who produced South Pacific, the great musical, was all over. She cashed in her chips and got the Grand Central Station and sped her way to New York and showed up on Averell's doorstep and never, ever bothered to check out. But all that has nothing to do with Churchill. Churchill was determined to see Mr. Stalin, and so was FDR. So they decided they could meet in Tehran. Now, I've been to Tehran. It's a wonderful city. And they don't very much care that we met there because it's not a high celebration for the Iranians. But they do mark the spot. So you can imagine that there are several spots they mark the way they caught up with our embassy crowd and got them in jail. Not a friendly job. And they mark lots of things that are not happy with the Iranians. So nevertheless, you can see that spot in Tehran where they met, the big three. Now, what was Stalin so interested in? Well, they had a Russian joke. It wasn't a joke. The Russian said, quote, "You're willing to die to the last Russian," end quote. Meaning, where the hell are the Allies? The Russians are bleeding to death. You know, it is now figured that, let alone the Russian killed by Stalin, but the Germans killed approximately 32 million casualties, KIA, killed in action. Now, we would have probably surrendered. We've never had that enormous casualties, but the Russians have, and so they were bitter. And Stalin wanted to give his oar in. So the moment they're meeting, Stalin raised the question, where the hell is the second front? Why aren't you launching a second front to take the pressure off me? I have fallen back to Stalingrad. I've fallen back to the gates of Moscow. I've fallen back to the palaces around Leningrad. And you, what have you done? Now, Churchill tried to make light of this by saying, well, we've invaded Morocco, French Morocco. Well, Stalin was dumbfounded. That doesn't get you any closer to Berlin than invading Brazil. He wanted a second front in France to plow across France and to cross the Rhine and to defeat Nazi Germany. He wasn't interested in Eisenhower, who was then sleeping in you can't guess where. He was going to get the command of landings at Normandy, but in the meantime, he was sleeping in the Rock of Gibraltar. The rock is not a rock. It's been carved out since the Napoleonic days, and it was asleep 2,000 men. And so Ike and his command had a beautiful view of North Africa. It's pathetic. Stalin was bleeding to death, and we were in Casablanca, setting the place up for Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman in a movie, For All the World Cared. And when we broke out of North Africa, we broke out into Algeria, where a friend of mine, Anis, is from. And Algeria, we broke out into Tunisia. This is all French North Africa. Who gives a hoot in hell about French North Africa when the Nazis are in control of continental Europe? And there was a stormy session in Tehran because Stalin was not impressed. So FDR, as he was wont to do to make peace, happy times are here again, he promises Stalin at Tehran that he will appoint a commanding general for Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. And that man, the man who wanted it, the man who really organized victory in the West, was General Marshall. But FDR knew he couldn't live without Marshall. So he gave the command to Dwight David Eisenhower. And Eisenhower then left the boot of Italy, where he was futzing around, and went to London and began to organize this very difficult landing in Normandy. And so Stalin got his delayed promise, and that seemed to make people happy. The conference broke up, this November 42 conference, and FDR had more to do. He was over there, so he thought he'd get it all done. So he went to Cairo, and he met with Chiang Kai-shek, who he expected to be the leader of a free China. Little did he know. And then he went home. It's a hard trip for FDR. Again, every time I say it, I will repeat it. He was totally crippled man. So the first meeting came and then went. And there wasn't to be another meeting until July of 45. Things had changed by then. We were at last on the move. Churchill was getting anxious because he just disliked FDR's constantly picking away that Churchill should consider giving India its independence. Churchill had a famous answer, quote, "I was not elected first minister to the king to set upon the dissolution of the British Empire," end quote, meaning over my dead body. Well, it was going to come, body or not, but that was another story, India and partition. Right now is just getting the war to come to a close. So a decision was made. This time it was easy for Stalin because it would be on his territory. You see, Stalin was unlike the others. He was afraid to leave his country because there could be a coup d'etat, meaning he'd be out of job. And when he came home, they'd shoot him. So he invited everybody to Yalta. Now, I've been to Yalta also, and it's a very wonderful place. No wonder the czars always went there for their vacations. The palace complexes are great. The ability to move around, everyone had a little palace of their own. You know, the czar's family was taken and then butchered out near the Ural Mountains, but one got away. She had remained late at Yalta. She loved it so, and she was the Tsar's mother, Anastasia's grandmother. And a British warship, since she was British, she's one of Victoria's children, British warship came in all the way to the Black Sea, all the way to Yalta, picked her up and took her back to Britain. So she's the only one who could identify anybody who survived that awful butchering that took place in the Urals. You can go there now. They've made a monument out of it. They've dug up the bones. They brought all the bones of the Tsar and his family back to St. Petersburg, and they're buried in a very special niche at the Peter and Paul Fortress, which is a church as well as a fortress in St. Petersburg. But What is important is that these big three, as they're called, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, by then had decided how to divide up the known world. And to them, of course, the known world was Eurocentric. After the war, it won't be. After the war, the European great powers, Britain, Germany, France, are too weak to play a role. And so the great powers are the USA and the USSR. And within 2 years, we have the Cold War. But before we get there, we have to get through this Yalta conference. It was very cheerful, lots of pictures taken. There's a very sad case that then leads to an awful case in American history. There was in the FDR delegation a man named Alger Hiss. Of that, there is no debate. Hiss was also a Soviet agent. That there's always been a debate. We had a silly person at Berkeley who for years maintained that Hiss was innocent. Well, he wasn't. Hiss led to a big campaign after the war. They even went out into a pumpkin patch in Pennsylvania and searched for a typewriter that Whittaker Chambers told them would be there. It would be a typewriter that indicts Hiss and any number of other people. The first thing you know, we have espionage after espionage case. We have the saddest case I know. I'm a devout believer that you should not have capital punishment. One of the reasons why is you often make a mistake and it's too late to correct it. But in the process, the Rosenbergs, due to their awful guy relative who wanted to save his own skin, were indicted and found guilty and were executed in the gas chamber. The mother of 2 small boys. And the number of people who made their career over Hiss, the pumpkin papers, you can't believe what we went through. They used to celebrate it at Berkeley, a bunch of rather conservative Democrats. Paul Seabury at Berkeley and Seymour Martin Lipset at Stanford had an annual dinner called the Pumpkin Papers Irregulars, celebrating the collapse of Hiss and his case and all the other people involved, including the woman, I think mainly of her, although her husband also was electrocuted. And that was only part of the story. It's too long and too ugly and too mean-spirited to go into. Nixon claimed his fame out of that. But as we went on at Yalta, by then we were dividing the world. We had to know how it was going to end. Germany was going to collapse, that was obvious. The largest tank battle in the world had been fought in the Soviet Union, the Battle of Kursk, and they had won. The Battle of Stalingrad, the Battle of the Snow, and they had won. These are amazing victories. And they were fought against competent, not Nazi, but competent German generals. The man in charge of the Russian campaign, when he heard that a Nazi soldier, a German soldier, had raped a Russian woman, he had the man tried and executed. For no decent German would do such a thing. It's a very different war from the one you always hear about. But the big question was, when all of this was done, how were these great armies going to run into each other? After all, one is coming from the east and one is coming from the west, and they're going at 100 miles an hour. The Americans particularly wanted the war over. Americans didn't want to liberate Paris. They said, let the French liberate Paris. The Americans wanted victory in Europe now. And they would do everything they could to get it. Although they were startled when they started to run into death camps for Jews, not just labor camps, death camps. The first the Americans could see of the horror was Dachau, because it's in the west of Germany. Most of the great camps, great in the sense of large, most of the large camps were in the east, particularly the largest death camp in the world, Dachau. But there were others, but enough. What we know is that the war was going to come to an end, and there was still another war to go. The war with Japan is not near yet. So they began to figure how they're going to do it. The Elbe River is the great river. If we can learn to stop at the Elbe, we won't run into each other. The Russians will come up to the one bank of the Elbe and we'll come up to the other. So it looked on the map. Of course, it wasn't quite as easy to do. So it was that we did it. And that was a good thing, that we could bring it to a close as fast as possible. The British had already done a huge effort. They'd come in and release Sweden from the bondage of Nazi occupation, because Sweden had been destroyed by her own acquisling. It made it possible for the Nazis to take Sweden over, Norway, if you wish, and then Sweden. And Norway became free, and then we were all quite concerned then, because suddenly somebody had heard from New Jersey. Who the hell cares about New Jersey? Well, there was a guy living there named Einstein, and he'd written a letter to FDR. And FDR read the letter, and it said, it is possible that the German war machine will build a nuclear weapon, and we should not allow that to happen. And so we launched at the University of California at Berkeley, which, by the way, for all you peace-loving Berkeleyites, the University of California, Berkeley has built every nuclear weapon in the American nuclear arsenal. You often see a great number of grandmothers out on Oxford Street, and they are demonstrating against the contract that we have at the University of California to overwatch the arsenal, because they have to be carefully watched. Terrible things that one runs into when one runs out of a war now and into a war to come. And so it is that we move through this period, and as we get closer, it's quite obvious. I don't know if any of you have, I sent as many of you as I know a picture Christmas card of me at Yalta. And there's Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Stalin. And the process is one that you can tell from the picture that FDR is dying. He does return to the White House. It's a very difficult trip. And then he does die at Warm Springs. and Harry Truman is president of the United States. And Harry knows nothing about anything. Talk about a loose cannon. FDR was a terrible administrator. He never kept anyone informed. His own Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, had to do, FDR said, you take care of South America and I'll take care of the rest. Really? Well, what happens when you die, Mr. Roosevelt? Well, we won't think about that. Well, now we have to. Eleanor has welcomed Harry to the White House, unbeknownst to Harry, who knows nothing about anything anyway. And she says when the door opens, "Good afternoon, Mr. President." And then the load of bricks fell on Harry of Independence, Missouri, a haberdasher. He was a great president, but he had a lot of catching up to do. And so they felt, the big three at Yalta, that there should be a concluding meeting of the big three, and that would be at Potsdam. And Potsdam is a wonderful, wonderful German town. It's a royal town. It's the town that Frederick the Great, made a palatial estate out of, his own palace, Sanssouci. He was a funny German. He was gay. Frederick the Great, gay. Well, things happen. And he spoke nothing but French. He insisted that the man who took care of his dogs be able to speak French. And he entertained nothing but Frenchmen there, to include the greatest of Frenchmen in his day, Voltaire. That's Frederick the Great, and that's the palace complex he built at Potsdam. And Potsdam is, of course, going to be in the Russian zone of divided Berlin. And Berlin is to be divided into three sectors: French, British, American, and Russian. And Stalin is very rude about it. He said, well, if you want to give the French a sector, you take it out of your sector. You're not taking it out of mine. Same was true of the great city of Vienna, 3 sectors. And same for Austria. 4 sectors in Vienna and 4 sectors in Austria. So all this was being concluded. At the same time, everybody knew that it wasn't going to work out. What happened? Well, what happened was that Churchill had been unelected. The unbelievable was believable. The British people had so tired of this long war. They'd been in it much longer than we had. They lost more, and they would lose the empire. And so they voted Churchill out of office. And Clement Attlee, who knew nothing about anything either, he was as dumb as Truman when it came to what was going on. In fact, Mr. Churchill was told after the election, and he was de-elected, that Mr. Attlee he was very humble. And Churchill, in his own nasty way, said, he has much to be humble for. And that was that. So you have a new British man show up, you have a new American man, and Stalin. 3, but only 1 who had been at the first 2. Now, there's something odd about people from Missouri. They don't trust people on first seeing. So Mr. Truman had gotten word from General Grove. General Grove was the overall commanding officer of something that was going on in the deserts of the West. And that desert in the West had a famous Berkeley physicist, Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer had yea and behold, he had set off a nuclear explosion. It was in a tower, wasn't dropped from a plane, but it had worked. And they were each handmade, so there were only 3 of them in existence at the time. But Truman decided he would hint to Stalin that he, there at Potsdam, had control over a brand new big weapon. And Truman was surprised that Stalin didn't blink. Of course he didn't blink. He knew all about Almagordo. He knew about the nuclear weapon, his espionage network, and it was soon to give him the key that he was waiting for, the firing mechanism that fired the nuclear charge that started the explosion. And he was going to get that from the contacts that Ethel and Julius Rosenberg had. So you can imagine the furor in America when all this became known, that our secrets, and we had worked with lots of people on these nuclear, we had worked with a great Italian physicist, Fermi, who was located at the University of Chicago. So was our great chancellor to be. He was at University of Chicago at the time. All these people, all the British scientists came over and worked with us. And so it was an Allied secret on the Western Allied side, not on the Soviet side. It didn't matter. What they didn't know, they'd steal, and they stole. So within a year, they're going to explode a nuclear weapon, and then the cat has got the mouse. There is no way that you can keep a lid on. And now they're around 7, might be more. The Israelis never admit they have the bomb, but they certainly do. They exploded it in South Africa when they were working with that awful regime in the apartheid regime in South Africa. The regime gave them permission to explode the weapon in the Kalahari, and they did. Pakistan has the weapon. India has the weapon. France has many of the weapons. She has them in all 3 dimensions. France has Mirage bombers delivering the weapon. She has nuclear submarines at sea with a weapon. And she has silos in the Massif Central in the middle of France with the weapons. Britain obviously has the weapon because we share it with her, because she shared with us during the war. Japan could have the weapon in a matter of minutes. The People's Republic of China has the weapon. PRC weapon was developed by a man who was trained at UC Berkeley. The circle goes round and round. He studied nuclear physics at Berkeley, learned all he could, went home, built them a bomb. Why not? Everybody should have one. The world would be better off without any, but you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. So from India to Pakistan, soon probably Iran, Israel. The Germans could have it, but don't want it. The French have it, the British have it, the Americans have it. And of course, Soviet Russia has it aplenty. And so all this is bubbling up at Potsdam. It's a very nice conference. By the way, the conference rooms have been preserved there. They're in perfect shape. The table is exactly as it was. It's a round table. The chairs are as they were, the delegations' rooms, side rooms are as they were. The whole thing is like a museum. Now, they didn't ruin Frederick's palace. Sanssouci can still be seen. When the Russians entered Potsdam to be part of their zone, the Germans were sure that the Russians would desecrate Frederick, so they dug him up. They took him all the way down to the Bavarian Alps, and they buried him down there, so no Russians could get at him. Now that Germany is united, they've dug him up again. They've moved him all the way back. And this time, when they first dug him up, he was buried where he didn't want to be buried, in a church, the Kaiserhof Memorial Church. He always wanted to be buried in the lawn with his dogs, and his family was outraged. And so when he died, they disregarded his wishes and they buried him in the church, and then they dug him up and they moved to Bavaria, and then they moved him back. This time, Frederick got his way. So if you want to visit Frederick the Great's burial site, it's out in the yard with his dogs. So much for Kaisers and the world that has been destroyed. So I don't know what else I can tell you about these big three. They were important conferences. They set the groundwork for the world that we live in today. There have been some changes. The Russians have changed. Now they have Putin. We've changed. We had Trump. Now we'll have Biden. The British have made some serious errors. They're leaving the common market, major error. They will be very badly disappointed. And the United Kingdom will probably break in two. It's quite obvious that the Scottish National Party is moving towards an election to leave Great Britain and to form an independent Scotland, and for that independent Scotland to join the European Union. Boris, if we had our problems with Trump, they've got serious problems with Boris. So the world isn't exactly like Yalta left it, but it's our Potsdam for that matter. And it's a case of trying to piece things together. And when we meet the next time, we'll talk about how that got unpieced and then pieced. We'll talk about VE Day, Victory in Europe, a very important day for us when Nazi Germany was defeated and was a rubble pile. And we built it up. Everybody else was a rubber pile. You wanted to see a lot of rubble, you can go to London. You didn't have to go to Germany. The industry that was in France and northern France, in the Midlands of England, was bombed out. Without the Marshall Plan, they couldn't have lived. We built Europe again, brick by brick, mortar by mortar, until they could stand on their own feet. We unified Germany. The others didn't want to, but we said, we're doing it. And we got West Germany on its feet. East Germany had a long way to go because the Russians weren't about to join us, and certainly weren't about rebuilding the old Reich of Herr Hitler. But we did what we did, and we were quite pleased with the results. Europe got back on its feet. We tried to have conferences again. We had big 3 conferences, but they were US, the United Kingdom, and France, trying to get the French back within the international system, playing a role with us. They had a slice of Germany to control. Was the Rhineland, mainly, with their troops stationed mainly at Baden-Baden. They always did choose the best resorts. The Forces Françaises in Alemania. And we in the south of Germany and the British in the north made together the Western German state that we then decided had to be, under a good man, Herr Adenauer, a united Germany. And all that grew out of these big 3 conferences of World War II. They were the conferences Potsdam, excuse me, I'm going backwards, the conference at Tehran in Iran, the conferences at Yalta in the Crimea, and then the conferences at Potsdam with mainly new members. Churchill gone, Attlee replacing, FDR dead, Truman replacing, and Stalin hanging on, the old monster that he was and still was and will be for several years to come. It was a difficult time for us to adjust to, particularly since many in America wanted us to not to adjust, to just get uninvolved. We didn't belong in, we belonged out. But better people, particularly the great man himself, who's seldom given credit, General of the Armies, George Catlett Marshall. He found a little college up in Massachusetts known as Harvard. He could have gone to Berkeley, but he went to Harvard, it's closer. He gave a little speech, one of the great speeches of post-war world. It's the Marshall Plan. We'll help rebuild you. And we invite the Soviet Union to partake. Odd. Of course, they didn't come. But boy, did the Europeans come. And they wanted everything. They wanted a whole factory. They wanted us to send them a kind of Ford Motor Company in reverse. And it made them very successful because what they wanted was the latest technology. They didn't want any old stuff. You're going to give us something, give us a new steel mill. And so therefore, once the Marshall Plan succeeded, the Europeans were more competitive than we were because all their stuff was new stuff and all of our stuff was old stuff. So they recovered and they went on. But those conferences are remembered because a system of possible true world government had been missed. We did get the UN. Everybody joined. It wasn't like the League of Nations. There was no disappointment. Russians, the Soviets joined. But it wasn't to be if you had one of the big leaders, the permanent members of the Security Council, able to constantly veto anything and everything they wanted to. And they vetoed. The Russians were always hammering their gavel and casting their veto. So you didn't have a working United Nations, you just had a debating club. And only when they were foolish enough that they walked out could then our American delegation rush in and pass something. And of course, they did that at the most inopportune time. They walked out just as the Korean War started. And we rushed in and got a UN condemnation and a UN force built to fight that war. And the Russians have never, ever walked out again. They have a huge legation out on Long Island, very, very hush-hush. No one's allowed in, no one's allowed out. And they work their miracles from within. A strange world. But we will see what we will see. The next time we will fight World War II. But we'll go from VE. VE is victory in Europe. And we'll do it through 5 cycles. We'll do the battle of the sky. And we'll do the battle of the sand. And we'll do the battle of the snow. And we'll do the battle of the sea. And then we'll do the battle of the shore. So we'll do 5 battles and we'll have victory in Europe by just looking at those 5 phases. Otherwise, you're going to spend forever. And it's not necessary. Every little squirm and every little squirt is not necessary to understand how we won and they lost. And then we'll do the same thing for Japan, VJ Day. And it won't be these 5, it'll only be 3, and they won't be land, they'll be naval. 3 huge naval battles that seal the fate of the Japanese Empire, and where we became the ones that turned the tables. We always complained against those Germans. They're all using those damn submarines. They're always sinking us. Well, when we fought in the Pacific, we were the ones who were using lots of submarines, sinking lots of Japanese shipping, making Japan starve, as we had, in another way, made Germany starve. Or at the end of both VE and VJ Day, both the Japanese people and the German people were starving to death. There was no food. But you'll get a dose of that. Maybe it's too much for you and you'll want to read a book. But if not, you can certainly come down here and see what there is to see. So since we started on time, which is just a miracle around here, we're going to end a minute early so you can race off for a delicious dinner. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next week. Ciao.